Sometimes destiny doesn't announce itself with a crown. Sometimes it begins with a single mistake. The royal palace of Blackthorn had awakened long before sunrise, its endless stone corridors already alive with hurried footsteps, whispered orders, and the soft glow of hundreds of silver lanterns preparing for the moon ascension banquet. Every servant new tonight would be remembered for generations. Noble families from every allied pack would gather beneath one roof, each hoping to witness Alpha King Damian Blackwood choose the future course of the kingdom. For the servants, however, history meant longer hours, heavier trays, and one simple rule repeated until it became a prayer: never make a mistake. Emily Carter had spent nearly 5 years trying to follow that rule, yet somehow trouble always found her. A loose ribbon, a dropped pitcher, a tray balanced 1 inch too far to the left. None of it came from laziness. She simply had the unfortunate gift of turning ordinary moments into unforgettable accidents. The older maids called her hopeless. The younger ones laughed whenever she passed. Even the palace steward sighed every time her name appeared on the work schedule. Still, Emily arrived before everyone else each morning, quietly finishing the jobs nobody wanted, polishing marble floors until they reflected the chandeliers like frozen lakes, carrying firewood through winter storms, and delivering meals to aging guards who rarely received so much as a thank you. She never complained. Kindness was the only thing no one had managed to take from her. That morning the palace buzzed with unusual tension. Royal banners embroidered with silver wolves draped every balcony. Musicians rehearsed somewhere beyond the eastern courtyard, their distant melodies echoing through halls scented with cedar, beeswax, and fresh pine. Knights in polished armor lined the grand staircase while noble attendants rushed in every direction carrying velvet boxes, ceremonial swords, jeweled goblets, and garments worth more than most villages would earn in a lifetime. Emily lowered her eyes as she crossed the corridor, hoping to remain invisible. Invisible people, she had learned, survived the longest inside royal walls. She almost succeeded. Emily, the sharp voice of head housekeeper Margaret cut through the hallway. Every nearby servant instantly stopped moving. Emily turned so quickly that a folded linen nearly slipped from her hands. Yes, ma'am. Margaret stepped closer, holding something wrapped in deep midnight blue silk. Her expression revealed neither trust nor patience. His Majesty's Royal Cloak has just returned from the ceremonial chamber. It must be delivered to the private dressing room immediately. No delays, no distractions, and above all, she paused long enough for every servant nearby to stare directly at Emily. Do not embarrass this palace. Several maids exchanged knowing smiles. Emily swallowed and accepted the carefully folded bundle with both hands. Even through the fabric, she could feel the astonishing weight of the cloak. The embroidered silver threads shimmered beneath the silk covering, catching stray beams of morning sunlight. She had heard stories about it since childhood. Every Alpha King for nearly 4 centuries had worn that cloak during the moon ascension ceremony. It represented authority, sacrifice, and the promise to protect every citizen beneath the northern sky. Ordinary servants never touched it. Emily's heartbeat quickened. I won't fail, she whispered, though the words sounded far less convincing than she hoped. Margaret simply nodded once before turning away. Emily adjusted her grip and began walking toward the western wing, where only the highest-ranking attendants were permitted. The palace seemed strangely quieter there. Thick stone walls softened every sound. Tall stained-glass windows painted ribbons of blue and silver across the polished floor. Her footsteps echoed gently as she focused on each careful stride. Left foot, right foot, slow and steady. She was only a few yards from the carved oak doors leading to the royal chambers when fate chose its moment. A young page hurried around the corner carrying an armful of scrolls. Emily instinctively stepped aside to avoid colliding with him. The heel of her simple work shoe caught the edge of an uneven stone. Time seemed to hesitate. Her balance shifted. Her fingers tightened too late. The silk covering slipped. The magnificent royal cloak unfolded into the air like a dark midnight sky before drifting silently toward the polished marble floor. Every sound inside the corridor disappeared. The cloak landed without a sound. Yet to Emily it felt as though the entire palace had heard the impact. She froze where she stood, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and dread as the rich midnight fabric spread across the polished marble, its silver embroidery shimmering beneath the morning light. For one endless heartbeat, nobody moved. Then came the sharp gasp of a nearby attendant, followed by another, until whispers rippled through the corridor like wind through winter branches. Every servant knew the stories surrounding the Royal Cloak. It was never to touch the ground before the Moon Ascension banquet. It symbolized the dignity of the throne, and every generation treated it with quiet reverence. Emily dropped to her knees so quickly that the linen apron around her waist brushed the cold stone. Her trembling hands reached for the cloak with the greatest care she could manage, carefully lifting each fold as though afraid even the air might damage it further. "I am so sorry," she whispered to no one in particular, although nobody answered. Instead, she could feel dozens of eyes fixed upon her. The young page who had rushed around the corner looked pale enough to disappear into the marble walls. He opened his mouth as if to apologize for startling her, but fear closed it again. Everyone understood an unspoken truth inside the palace. Blame rarely traveled upward. It settled on whoever stood lowest. Emily was still gathering the final edge of the cloak when the steady sound of polished boots echoed from the western passage. The whispers vanished instantly. Servants lowered their heads. Guards straightened their shoulders. Even the chandeliers seemed to hang perfectly still. Head housekeeper Margaret appeared first, her face drained of every trace of color. She took one horrified look at Emily kneeling on the floor and closed her eyes for the briefest moment, as though silently preparing for disaster. "Stand up," Margaret said quietly, but Emily's legs refused to obey. Before she could try again, another pair of footsteps entered the corridor. They were slower than everyone else's. Deliberate, measured, unhurried. Nobody needed to look up to know who had arrived. Alpha King Damien Blackwood never announced himself. His presence did that for him. Emily felt the atmosphere change before she gathered the courage to lift her eyes. Dark Boots stopped only a few feet away. The hem of a tailored black coat remained perfectly still. She could not bring herself to look any higher. Every frightening rumor she had ever heard returned at once. They said the Alpha King rarely raised his voice because silence made people reveal more than shouting ever could. They said he remembered every face he had ever seen. They said nothing escaped his notice. Emily's fingers tightened around the folded cloak. "Your Majesty," Margaret said carefully, bowing so low her forehead nearly reached the floor. "This servant accepts full responsibility for assigning the wrong made to this task." Emily's heart sank. Margaret was trying to protect the palace staff, but Emily knew the truth. The mistake had been hers alone. She swallowed hard before finding enough courage to speak. "No, Your Majesty." Her voice barely carried through the corridor. "It was entirely my fault." Silence answered her confession, long enough for doubt to creep into every corner of her mind. She imagined being dismissed from the palace before sunset. She imagined packing the few belongings she owned into a worn canvas bag. She imagined never seeing these halls again, despite all the lonely years she had spent serving within them. Then something unexpected happened. The Alpha King stepped closer instead of farther away. Emily noticed only because his shadow quietly covered the sunlight falling across the marble. She lowered her head even more, unable to meet his gaze. A gloved hand reached toward the cloak. Instead of pulling it away sharply, he lifted one corner with remarkable care, brushing away a single speck of dust that probably had never been there at all. His movements were calm, almost thoughtful. That somehow unsettled Emily more than anger would have. She finally dared to glance upward. For the first time in her life, she found herself looking directly into the silver eyes of Damien Blackwood. They were neither cold nor warm. They simply observed, quietly and completely, as though searching for something hidden beneath everything she had tried so desperately to become. Emily instinctively stepped backward beneath the weight of that gaze. One step, then another. She barely realized she was retreating until her shoulders gently met the smooth stone wall behind her. There was nowhere else to go. The corridor had become impossibly silent once again. Every servant remained perfectly still, afraid even to breathe. Damien closed the remaining distance with slow, unhurried confidence before stopping just far enough away to leave respectful space between them. His attention never drifted toward the frightened attendants or the terrified housekeeper. It remained entirely on Emily. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke only 4 quiet words. "Look at me, Emily." Emily lifted her eyes because refusing a direct request from the Alpha King would have been even more terrifying than facing whatever judgment awaited her. The moment her gaze met Damien Blackwood's, the rest of the palace seemed to disappear. The whispers, the servants, the distant music preparing for the banquet all faded into a strange silence that neither of them appeared eager to break. She had expected to find anger in his expression, perhaps disappointment or quiet disapproval. Instead, she found something far more unsettling. Curiosity. It was subtle, almost impossible to notice, yet it lingered behind those striking silver eyes as though he were trying to solve a mystery that only he could see. Emily's pulse echoed loudly inside her ears. She lowered her hands, still carefully holding the folded royal cloak against her chest, afraid that even breathing too deeply might create another disaster. Damien remained perfectly still. The morning light streaming through the stained glass windows painted ribbons of blue and silver across the corridor, reflecting softly against the polished marble beneath. Their feet. His dark coat barely moved, yet his presence seemed to fill every corner of the hallway. It was not loud authority. It was quiet certainty, the kind that never needed to prove itself. Emily had served inside these walls for years, but this was the closest she had ever stood to the king. She suddenly understood why even experienced generals became careful with every word around him. He listened with complete attention. He observed everything, every nervous breath, every trembling finger, every attempt to hide fear. "How long have you worked here?" he finally asked. His voice was calm, carrying neither accusation nor sympathy. Emily blinked in surprise. Of all the questions she had imagined, that one had never crossed her mind. "Almost 5 years, Your Majesty," she answered softly. 5 years, Damien repeated, as though weighing the number against something only he understood. His eyes drifted briefly toward the royal cloak before returning to her face. "And yet I do not remember seeing you." Emily offered a faint, uncertain smile that disappeared almost immediately. "That means I was doing my job well, Your Majesty. Servants are not supposed to be noticed." For the briefest instant, something changed in Damien's expression. It was so slight that anyone standing farther away would have missed it completely. The corner of his mouth almost softened before settling once again into its usual composure. Behind Emily, several servants exchanged puzzled glances. They had expected orders. Punishment. Dismissal. Instead, the king continued asking simple questions as though time itself had slowed. "Were you afraid?" Damien asked. Emily looked down for a moment before answering honestly. "I still am." Another silence settled between them, but it no longer felt as cold. Damien's gaze never left her. There was something strangely familiar about the quiet young maid standing before him, although he was certain they had never spoken before this morning. He had spent years surrounded by noble families, ambitious politicians, and powerful alphas whose scents filled every royal gathering long before they entered a room. Emily carried none of that confidence. She stood with humility, shoulders slightly lowered, trying to become as small as possible. Yet there was another presence surrounding her that refused to fit within anything he understood. It was delicate, almost impossible to detect, like the first breeze that arrived before spring. He breathed slowly, almost without realizing it. Again, that impossible impression brushed against his senses. It was not perfume. It was not flowers or cedar or lavender like the palace gardens. It reminded him of fresh snowfall beneath a full moon, untouched forests after midnight, and distant starlight reflected across a frozen lake. The feeling vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Damien frowned almost imperceptibly. Impossible. No record within the royal archives described such a scent. Not among alphas. Not among betas. Not even among omegas. Emily noticed the brief change in his expression and immediately assumed she had somehow made matters worse. "Your Majesty," she whispered carefully, "if I have dishonored the palace, I accept whatever responsibility is mine. Please do not blame the other servants. They warned me to be careful. I simply failed." Margaret closed her eyes, silently wishing the young maid would stop speaking before she accidentally offended the throne again. Instead, Damien turned his attention toward the gathered staff for only a moment. Every servant immediately lowered their heads. "Return to your duties," he said quietly. Nobody hesitated. Within seconds, the corridor emptied with astonishing speed until only Margaret remained several respectful steps away. Damien looked back at Emily. The strange feeling had already faded, yet one thought refused to leave him. This morning should have been forgotten before the banquet even began. Instead, he found himself asking a question that surprised even him. "Emily Carter," he said, speaking her full name with deliberate clarity. "Who were your parents?" Emily's heartbeat stopped. She opened her mouth to answer, but for the first time since entering the palace 5 years earlier, she realized she did not truly know the story herself. Emily lowered her eyes again, not because she wished to avoid the question, but because she had searched for that answer since she was old enough to understand what family meant. A quiet breath escaped her before she finally spoke. "I do not know, Your Majesty." Damien remained silent, allowing her to continue without interruption. "I was told that I was found as an infant outside the Eastern Chapel after a winter storm. The sisters who cared for abandoned children raised me until they could no longer afford to keep everyone. When I turned 16, they arranged for me to work here." She offered a small smile that carried more gratitude than sadness. "The palace gave me a place to belong." Damien studied her expression carefully. She did not sound rehearsed. She did not seem to be hiding anything. If anything, her honesty appeared almost unfamiliar inside walls where carefully chosen words were often more common than truth itself. Margaret quietly stepped forward. "Your Majesty, the records support her account. She has served faithfully since her arrival. There have been occasional accidents, but never dishonesty." Emily's cheeks warmed with embarrassment at the familiar description. Damien noticed the faint change in her expression and unexpectedly found it genuine rather than awkward. She accepted criticism without resentment, almost as though she believed she deserved less than everyone around her. That realization unsettled him far more than the dropped cloak. Outside the corridor, bells echoed across the palace grounds, reminding every department that only a few hours remained before distinguished guests would begin arriving. Servants hurried through nearby halls carrying fresh flowers, polished silver trays, and embroidered banners bearing the royal crest. The palace had returned to its endless rhythm, yet the quiet corner where Emily stood felt untouched by the growing excitement. Damien glanced once toward the tall, stained glass windows where morning sunlight had become brighter, scattering brilliant colors across the floor between them. Something about the scene felt strangely familiar, although memory refused to explain why. "Who taught you to remain so calm?" he asked unexpectedly. Emily blinked. "Calm?" she repeated. Softly. Most people would still be trying to defend themselves. She considered his words before answering. "The sisters at the chapel used to say that fear grows louder when we argue with it. They believed kindness should speak first." She hesitated before adding with a gentle laugh, "I have not always succeeded, but I have tried." Damien looked at her for another long moment. Around him, countless nobles had spent years competing for influence, titles, and recognition. Many spoke elegantly about honor while quietly pursuing their own advantage. Yet this young maid, dressed in a simple gray uniform with flowers still dusting one sleeve from the palace kitchens, spoke about kindness as though it required no reward at all. He found himself wondering how many people had overlooked her simply because they had never truly looked. Emily noticed his silence and assumed she had once again said something inappropriate. "I am sorry if I spoke out of turn, Your Majesty." "You did not," Damien replied. His answer came so naturally that even he seemed mildly surprised by it. Margaret watched the exchange with growing confusion. She had served the royal household for more than 20 years. Never once had she seen the Alpha King continue a conversation with a servant after an incident like this. Efficiency usually came first. Decisions were made quickly. Schedules continued without delay. Yet this morning, time itself appeared willing to wait. A cool breeze drifted through the open corridor, carrying the fresh scent of pine from the northern gardens. Emily instinctively tucked a loose strand of light brown hair behind her ear before tightening her careful hold on the royal cloak once again. Damien noticed the gesture, simple and unguarded, and that same impossible impression returned. Faint, fleeting, like distant moonlight touching fresh snow before dawn. It disappeared before he could understand it, leaving behind only unanswered questions. Somewhere deep within the palace, an ancient grandfather clock marked another passing hour. Damien finally shifted his attention toward Margaret. "Prepare another attendant to complete the ceremonial arrangements," he said calmly. Margaret bowed immediately. "Yes, Your Majesty." Emily's heart quietly sank. Of course, she had expected this from the beginning. Someone more capable would finish the assignment she had failed. She lowered the royal cloak respectfully, ready to hand it over without complaint. Before she could, Damien raised one hand slightly. "Not her," he said. Emily looked up in surprise. "She will finish what she started." Both Emily and Margaret stared at him in complete disbelief. Damien's expression remained composed, but his next words carried quiet certainty that neither of them could explain. One mistake does not define a person's worth. For the first time since arriving at the palace 5 years earlier, Emily felt someone had seen more than the clumsy servant everyone else believed her to be, and she could not shake the feeling that this unexpected act of trust was only the beginning of a story neither of them yet understood. Emily could hardly believe what she had heard. For several quiet seconds, she simply stood there holding the royal cloak, wondering if she had misunderstood the Alpha King's words. Margaret appeared equally surprised, but years of discipline quickly returned to her expression. She gave a respectful nod and stepped back without another question. Inside the palace, the king's decision was never debated. It was carried out. Emily carefully adjusted the folds of the cloak exactly as she had been taught before continuing toward the private dressing chamber. Every step felt lighter than the last, yet confusion remained close behind. She had expected to lose her position before noon. Instead, the highest authority in the kingdom had entrusted her to complete the very task she had almost ruined. The thought refused to leave her mind. By the time she reached the carved oak doors leading to the royal dressing suite, 2 senior attendants opened them in silence. Emily entered carefully, her eyes immediately drawn to the remarkable simplicity of the room. Unlike the grand audience halls filled with gold and crystal, the king's private chamber reflected quiet restraint. Dark walnut shelves lined the walls, holding neatly arranged books, maps, and carefully preserved family heirlooms. A large stone fireplace stood unlit beneath a portrait of previous rulers, while tall windows overlooked the northern forest stretching toward distant, snow-covered mountains. Everything appeared orderly, practical, and timeless. Emily approached the ceremonial stand placed beside an antique mirror nearly 8 feet tall. With steady hands, she unfolded the royal cloak and draped it across its polished silver frame exactly as instructed. She carefully smoothed every wrinkle before taking one final step backward to inspect her work. Perfect. A small breath of relief escaped her lips. She quietly bowed toward the empty chamber before leaving without disturbing a single object. She never noticed the pair of silver eyes observing from the adjoining study through a partially open doorway. Damien remained completely still until the doors closed behind her. Only then did he shift his attention toward his longtime advisor, Theodore Ashcroft, who had entered moments earlier carrying several official documents. Theodore followed the king's gaze toward the empty doorway before raising one curious eyebrow. "The young maid?" he asked. Damien gave a thoughtful nod. "Emily Carter." Theodore searched his memory. "I recognize the name only because the staff occasionally mentions her unfortunate accidents." A faint smile almost appeared on Damien's face. "That is not what caught my attention." Theodore waited patiently. The 2 men had worked together for nearly 15 years. He understood that the king often spoke only after arranging every thought with care. Damien walked toward the window overlooking the palace gardens where dozens of servants prepared flower displays for the evening celebration. Among them, he quickly recognized Emily despite the distance. Rather than joining the louder conversations, she quietly knelt beside an elderly gardener whose basket of white roses had tipped across the pathway. Without being asked, she helped gather every blossom before carrying the heavy basket the remaining distance herself. The gardener smiled warmly. Emily smiled back, accepted no praise, and returned to her own duties as though nothing remarkable had happened. Damien continued watching. Minutes later, another servant accidentally dropped several folded table linens while rushing toward the banquet hall. Before anyone else reacted, Emily bent down to help collect them. She laughed gently when the embarrassed servant apologized, reassuring her that everyone had difficult mornings. Soon afterward, she disappeared into the kitchens, where she quietly handed part of her own lunch to a young pantry assistant who looked too busy to eat. She never looked around to see whether anyone had noticed. She simply continued working. Theodore observed the scene through the same window. "Interesting," he admitted. Most people become careful only when they believe someone important is watching. Damien folded his hands behind his back. She behaves exactly the same when she believes no one is. Theodore considered that for a long moment. Would you like me to review her service records? Everything, Damien answered calmly. Her arrival, the chapel that raised her, employment records, medical records, any correspondence, every document connected to Emily Carter. Theodore looked genuinely surprised. You believe there is something unusual about her? Damien remained silent for several seconds before giving the only answer he trusted. I believe there are too many things that do not make sense. His advisor nodded once before leaving to begin the investigation. Damien remained alone beside the window, watching Emily disappear beyond the western courtyard with the same quiet determination she had shown all morning. The strange feeling that had briefly brushed against his senses still refused to leave his thoughts. He had spent years studying allies, rivals, and every influential bloodline across the kingdom. Yet somehow a humble palace made with no family name had become the one mystery he could not explain, and deep inside, he sensed that the answers waiting within her forgotten past would change far more than either of them could possibly imagine. By late afternoon, the palace had transformed into a living celebration. Crystal chandeliers glowed above the grand hall, while musicians tuned their instruments beneath towering arches carved with the history of the Northern Kingdom. Noble families began arriving, one elegant carriage after another, their embroidered cloaks and polished crests filling every corridor with quiet anticipation. Emily remained far from the ballroom, helping arrange fresh candles along a service hallway that connected the royal chambers to the ceremonial gallery. She preferred places where few people noticed her. The quieter the corner, the fewer opportunities she had to make another embarrassing mistake. Even after the king's unexpected kindness that morning, she still carried the memory of the fallen royal cloak inside her heart. She wanted nothing more than to finish the evening without drawing attention again. A sudden rush of footsteps echoed through the corridor. Two young pages hurried past carrying ceremonial scrolls, while several guards moved quickly toward the eastern entrance after receiving an urgent message. The atmosphere changed almost instantly. It was not panic, but heightened awareness. Emily stepped aside to allow everyone to pass before noticing an elderly palace historian standing near a staircase with a heavy stack of ancient books balanced unsteadily in his arms. Without hesitation, she walked over. "Please allow me to help you," she said with her familiar gentle smile. The old scholar looked relieved. Together, they carefully carried the books toward the royal archive room located beside the ceremonial gallery. As they reached the doorway, one of the large windows overlooking the palace gardens suddenly swung open beneath a strong evening breeze. A collection of fragile parchment maps resting on a nearby table lifted into the air, scattering across the polished floor. The elderly historian sighed with quiet disappointment. Some of those maps had been preserved for generations. Emily immediately placed the books down and hurried after the drifting pages before they could slide beneath nearby furniture or become damaged. She gathered each one with remarkable care, smoothing every delicate corner before returning them to the table exactly as she had found them. As she reached for the final parchment, something unusual happened. The fading sunlight passed through the stained glass above, filling the room with shimmering silver light. For the briefest instant, the intricate markings printed across the oldest map appeared to glow softly beneath Emily's fingertips. Tiny silver lines traced themselves across faded ink as though responding to her presence before disappearing just as quickly. Emily blinked, believing it had simply been a trick of the evening light. The elderly historian, however, had seen it as well. His eyes widened behind his spectacles, but before he could speak, the glow had vanished completely. "Curious," he whispered almost to himself. Emily looked at him with quiet concern. "Is something wrong?" The old man gently shook his head, although uncertainty remained written across his face. Perhaps these old eyes imagined it. Emily smiled politely, carefully returning the final map to its protective case. "Thank you for allowing me to help." She gathered the empty book straps and quietly excused herself, unaware that the historian continued staring at the ancient parchment long after she had gone. Minutes later, inside the royal gallery, Damien stood with Theodore reviewing the final preparations for the banquet when the elderly historian approached with unusual urgency. He bowed respectfully before speaking in a careful voice. "Your Majesty, I witnessed something today that I cannot explain." Damien turned his full attention toward him. "Tell me." The historian hesitated before answering. It involved the young maid named Emily Carter. Damien exchanged a brief glance with Theodore. The investigation had only just begun, yet somehow another unexpected piece had already found its way to the same quiet servant whose forgotten past continued to gather mysteries faster than anyone could uncover answers. The Moon Ascension banquet began beneath a ceiling of glittering crystal as nobles from every allied pack filled the grand hall with elegant conversation, music, and quiet ambition. Silver candles reflected across polished marble, while towering banners bearing the royal wolf crest stirred gently in the evening air. Emily remained hidden behind the carved service doors with the other attendants, carefully carrying polished trays and crystal glasses from one reception room to another. She reminded herself that tonight was not about her. It was about serving without being noticed. Yet she could not ignore the strange feeling that followed her since morning, as though invisible threads had quietly shifted around her life. Inside the royal gallery, Theodore returned carrying the first results of his investigation. He placed a small leather folder before Damien and spoke in a voice low enough that only the king could hear. The records become unusual after her arrival. Damien opened the file. Every employment document inside the palace was complete. Every work assignment had been recorded with remarkable precision. But every page concerning Emily's life before the chapel contained almost nothing. No family name beyond Carter. No birth certificate. No village of origin. No surviving relatives. The earliest record simply stated that an infant had been discovered outside St. Hilaire Chapel during the harshest snowstorm in decades. Damien slowly closed the folder. Nothing else. Theodore shook his head. "I searched every archive available to the crown. It is almost as though someone intentionally removed every trace of her past before she entered our kingdom." Before Damien could answer, the elderly historian arrived carrying one carefully wrapped bundle beneath his arm. He bowed respectfully before placing an ancient parchment upon the nearby table. "Your Majesty, this is the map I mentioned." He carefully unfolded the fragile document. Time had faded much of the ink, yet delicate silver markings still crossed its surface like winding rivers beneath moonlight. When the young woman touched this map, the historian explained, "These forgotten lines briefly shone with light. I have cared for this artifact for over 40 years. I have never witnessed such a thing." Damien studied the parchment in thoughtful silence. Along one corner rested a nearly invisible royal seal belonging to a dynasty that had disappeared centuries before the Blackwood family came to the throne. Theodore looked closer. "I thought those symbols were only decorative." The historian slowly shook his head. "No, they describe an ancient bloodline that served the moon goddess during the earliest years of the kingdom." Damien looked toward the ballroom, where music drifted softly through open doors. Somewhere beyond the celebrating guests, Emily continued carrying out her duties, completely unaware that forgotten history seemed to awaken whenever she came near it. "Can anyone else verify what you witnessed?" Damien asked. "No, Your Majesty," the historian admitted. The light disappeared almost immediately. "Had I looked away for even a second, I would have believed I imagined it." Damien remained silent before making a quiet decision. "Do not mention this to anyone." Both Theodore and the historian nodded without hesitation. Rumors spread quickly inside royal courts, and the king understood how dangerous unanswered mysteries could become. At that very moment, Emily walked through the outer gallery carrying a fresh arrangement of white lilies toward the banquet hall. As she passed an open balcony, cool moonlight briefly washed across her face. High above the palace, the full moon emerged from behind drifting clouds, brighter than anyone expected. Several elderly guests instinctively glanced toward the sky before exchanging uncertain looks. One elderly noblewoman quietly whispered, "The moon has not shone like that since the old stories." Emily never heard the remark. She simply continued walking with the same gentle humility she had carried every day of her life, never realizing that while she believed herself to be the smallest person inside the palace, the oldest secrets of the kingdom had already begun turning quietly in her direction. The music slowed as the first ceremonial dance came to an end, and the grand hall settled into a respectful silence while Alpha King Damian Blackwood stepped toward the center of the marble platform reserved for the royal address. Hundreds of noble guests turned their attention to the throne, expecting the traditional words that marked every Moon Ascension banquet. Emily remained near the edge of the service corridor, carefully arranging crystal glasses on a silver tray before the next course. From where she stood, she could see only part of the great hall through the open archway. She never imagined that anyone standing beneath the royal banners would notice an ordinary maid hidden among the servants. Damian thanked the assembled families for their loyalty, welcomed distinguished guests from neighboring pacts, and spoke of unity, responsibility, and the promise every ruler carried toward the people of the kingdom. His calm voice filled the enormous hall without effort, and every listener remained completely silent. Yet, even while addressing the kingdom, a small part of his attention continued returning to the unanswered questions surrounding Emily Carter. Theodore's investigation had uncovered almost nothing, while the ancient map and the historian's testimony only deepened the mystery. Damian had learned long ago that when facts disappeared, actions often revealed the truth instead. As the speech concluded, the master of ceremonies signaled for the attendants to begin serving refreshments. Emily lifted her silver tray and quietly entered the hall with the other servants, moving carefully between elegantly dressed guests. She kept her eyes lowered, just as she always had, making certain every glass reached the proper table without disturbing a single conversation. Several nobles barely acknowledged the servants passing beside them, while others continued discussing alliances and trade agreements as though the palace staff were invisible. Emily did not mind. She had grown accustomed to being overlooked. Near the front of the hall, an elderly duchess reached for a crystal glass just as her embroidered sleeve caught the edge of the tablecloth. A small porcelain cup tipped dangerously toward the polished floor. Before anyone else reacted, Emily gently set down her tray, caught the delicate cup with one hand, steadied the table with the other, and returned everything to its proper place without spilling a single drop. The Duchess looked up in surprise. Emily simply smiled warmly and continued on her way before thanks could even be offered. Damian witnessed the entire moment from the royal platform. There had been no audience for Emily's kindness. She believed nobody important had seen her. Yet once again, she had chosen to help without expecting recognition. The same pattern repeated itself throughout the evening. She quietly guided a nervous young attendant who had become lost among the banquet tables. She adjusted a chair for an elderly guest before he realized he needed assistance. She offered encouraging words to a frightened kitchen apprentice carrying his first ceremonial dessert. Each act was so small that most people overlooked it completely. Damian did not. He began to understand that Emily's greatest strength was not hidden power or forgotten nobility. It was the quiet consistency of her character. Long after praise had disappeared, she remained exactly the same person. As the evening continued, the full moon climbed higher beyond the towering windows, filling the grand hall with soft silver light. It settled naturally across the polished floor until one bright beam reached the place where Emily stood waiting for her next assignment. For a single peaceful moment, she seemed almost surrounded by moonlight itself. Several guests glanced toward the unusual reflection before returning to their conversations, dismissing it as little more than a beautiful coincidence. Damian, however, watched in thoughtful silence. Coincidences had become increasingly difficult to believe. Theodore quietly approached his side. "Your Majesty, shall we continue the investigation tomorrow?" Damian kept his eyes on Emily for another long moment before answering. "Yes, but from this moment forward, no decision concerning Emily Carter is to be made without my knowledge." Theodore bowed respectfully. The order was simple, yet its meaning was unmistakable. Without realizing it, the quiet Omega Maid who had spent years trying not to be noticed had become someone the Alpha King himself intended to protect until the truth hidden within her forgotten past finally stepped into the light. The celebration continued long into the evening, yet for Emily it felt as though the palace had quietly changed around her. Nothing looked different. Noble guests still laughed beneath crystal chandeliers. Musicians still filled the grand hall with graceful melodies. Servants still hurried from one room to another carrying polished silver trays. And yet the invisible certainty she had relied upon for years had disappeared. She could no longer pretend that she was simply another unnoticed maid. Somewhere inside the palace, questions were being asked about a past she had never known. When the final course had been served and the last ceremonial toast concluded, Emily carried a basket of folded table linens through the peaceful northern corridor. Moonlight poured through the tall windows, painting soft silver patterns across the marble floor. She paused for only a moment to admire the quiet beauty outside. Snow rested upon the distant mountain peaks, and the ancient pine forest surrounding the palace shimmered beneath the full moon. It was the kind of peaceful night that made the world feel larger than the worries of a single heart. Behind her, calm footsteps echoed through the corridor. Emily turned and immediately bowed. Damien had left the banquet without royal fanfare, accompanied only by the silence that always seemed to follow him. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The palace no longer felt crowded. It was simply a king and a young maid standing beneath the same moonlight that had watched over countless generations before them. "Did you enjoy the celebration?" Damien asked. Emily smiled gently. "I enjoyed seeing everyone happy, Your Majesty." "And were you happy?" The question caught her by surprise. She thought carefully before answering. "Today was frightening," she admitted honestly. "But it also reminded me that kindness can appear when we least expect it." Damien understood that she was thanking him without saying the words directly. He looked through the window toward the quiet forest before speaking again. "You believe people should be judged by a single mistake?" Emily shook her head immediately. "No, Your Majesty. If that were true, none of us would deserve a second chance." A quiet smile finally appeared across Damien's face, small enough that most people would never have noticed it. "Then remember your own advice." Emily lowered her eyes respectfully, carrying those simple words more carefully than any royal treasure. As Damien walked away, Theodore approached from the opposite hallway carrying another sealed folder. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "a messenger has arrived from St. Alara Chapel. The sisters discovered something among their oldest records after hearing that we had requested information." Damien accepted the worn envelope without opening it. The faded wax seal had nearly disappeared with age, but one symbol remained visible beneath the moonlight. It matched the forgotten emblem preserved upon the ancient map. Theodore noticed it at the same moment. Neither man spoke. They no longer believed the growing chain of coincidences was accidental. Far ahead, Emily disappeared around the corner carrying nothing more remarkable than folded linens and tomorrow's work schedule. She never saw the ancient seal. She never realized that answers buried for decades had finally begun returning to the palace. She simply continued living with the same quiet kindness that had carried her through every lonely year before this one. Yet somewhere beyond the snow-covered mountains, destiny had already begun moving toward her, one patient step at a time. And neither a forgotten past nor a hidden bloodline would matter nearly as much as the choices she would make when the truth finally arrived. If Emily's quiet courage and unwavering kindness touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and share it with someone who believes true strength is shown through compassion rather than power. Tell us in the comments, what do you think the forgotten records will reveal about Emily's past? And when did you first realize that the Alpha King saw something extraordinary in the humble Omega Maid that everyone else overlooked?